A lot of boring math later. 24 hours later. 1 week later. One long angry line later. 72 hours later. 2 hours later. Just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage. The next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, end of flashback. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later, more moments later, 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later!
5 minutes later.
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 82 kilometers later. A little later. 3 hours later. 1 season later. Many secret parties later. Moments later. 1 nap later. 1 very long digestive tract later. 6 months later. 1 pathetic sob story later. Later. Many minutes later. 3 hours later. The next morning. 1 shift later. The next day. The next morning. Later. The next... The next morning. Later that night. The next day. 1 weekend of pampering later. 1 hour later. Late again. You get the idea. 8 semesters later.
5,000 celebrities later.
6 months later!
Meanwhile, 1 little boost to the surface later.
A few minutes later. 1 hour later. 5 billion years later.
The next morning. Later. Later that night. The next evening. 1 operation later. 1 million, zillion, jillion, dillion, cotillion times later. Meanwhile, the next morning. Later. 1 hour later. 7 months later. The next Christmas. Several long days later. Many toys later. 12 sleepless hours later. 1 beautiful Christmas morning later. The next morning. The next morning. Many frame building attempts later. Even more boat building attempts later. 1 day later. 1 humongous meal later. 1 entree later. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Several bouquets later. 10 hours later. 6.5 hours later.
4 to 6 hours later. 200.5 years later. The next morning. 14 years in the void. 2,103 air flights later. On a loss. 4 to 6 years later. 4 to 6 bases later. 4 to 6 78 years later. 4 to 6 sweeter later. 4 to 6 birth later. Montage. 14 years later. By sheer coincidence. Just then. 3:46 a.m. 328 skies later. 421 news later. 2 hours later. 386 glitches later. 765 license later. A little morning. The new Sunday. Day 100. Uber later. 365 toys later. An awful morning. Flashback 2. End of flashback 2. 400 days later. Late again. You get the idea. Well, this brief construction montage isn't bad. 32 days later. 2 hours later. 1 hour later. 3 hours later. 6 months later. 438 days later. 219 minutes later. 5 minutes later. 4 to 6 20 minutes later. 4 to 6 splitter later. 200 planes later. 3 weeks later. Many months later. 10 days later. 20 TVs later.